Hello, everyone. I'm here with Professor Noam Chomsky, and as I was saying to him, his importance for me as a thinker, as an individual, and as a source of inspiration is really unmeasurable. So, thank you, Professor Chomsky, for joining me today.
Very pleased to be with you.
Thank you. Well, one of the quotes that you often cite is from the Delphic Maxims. It's the ancient Greek aphorism that it says, "Know thyself." You've quoted it many times before, so I wanted to dive deep into this concept and what it means to you. What does it mean to get to know oneself in this world?
It's the priestess at the Delphic Oracle knew what she was talking about. You have to find out what kind of a creature you are, what your values are, what your goals are, think them through, dissociate yourself as much as you can from conventional wisdom and standard doctrine, see to what extent it really reflects who you are, what your interests are, what your commitments are, and forge a conception of the kind of person you want to be, and then engage the world from that perspective.
Yeah, and with that in mind and your work in the linguistics field, I was wondering what is your perspective on how is reality shaped by language? Do you think reality comes as a product of language, or does language arise from reality? For us, at least.
Well, there is a thesis. It's called the Sapir-Whorf hypothesis, which holds that the nature of the language has a strong determinative factor on the way you perceive and interpret the world. Um, on the surface, it seems plausible. The way we speak is obviously connected to how we see the world. But there have been about 70 years of effort now to try to find a way to test the hypothesis and see if you can find any evidence for it. And it's been extremely thin. I mean, there's almost no evidence that the language you speak shapes your interpretation of the world. The way you use the language, of course, does, but that could be in any language. I could express, if I spoke Tagalog, I could express the same views in Tagalog, come out a little bit differently, but pretty much the same. So whatever effects there are seem pretty marginal.
Wow. And on that note, you talk on how it isn't that related, but in today's world, it seems that the movement towards mindfulness and being aware of one's thoughts and disassociating one's identity with one's thoughts has increasing in today's world. Do you think that our identities lie within our thoughts? Are we our own thoughts?
That's up to us. We can bend to custom, to authority, to what other people are doing and simply join the crowd. Or we can ask ourselves, is this really me? Do I want to be that, or am I a different person, namely myself? If you break with conformity and obedience, there's usually a cost. What the cost is can be disapproval, it can be a torture chamber. Depends what kind of society you're in. But if you go back all through history, back to classical Greece, the Hebrew prophets, all the way through, those who questioned, condemned crimes of the powerful, raised, tried to get people to think for themselves, they weren't treated nicely. And that goes right to the present.
Wow. Yeah, and that's a perfect way of putting it because my next question was with regards to what you were mentioning on the indoctrination and doctrines and what's happening in universities, and where truth was regarded as where universities was regarded as a place to discuss truth. But do you think that in today's world, where, for example, you've been writing a lot about this manufacturing consent and what does reality is and what truth actually is, and if we can access it, do you think we can engage in today's world on any given subject from a truthful standpoint in a world where everything seems to be doctored by someone else? How can we engage in truthful ways with the reality that surrounds us?
You could have asked the same question thousands of years ago. Without going back that far, take one of the first great works on classics on what was now called political science, political philosophy at the time. David Hume's book of the first principles of government, mid 18th century. His opening paragraph is worth reading and thinking about. He opens the book by saying, that he himself, he says, I'm amazed by the easiness with which the powerful control the general population. This is a mystery because power is in the hands of the governed, not the governors.
Wow.
So how do they achieve this how do they manage this enormous achievement? Said it must be by imposing consent, and what we now call manufacture of consent, must be by imposing consent. And if the implication is that if people could withdraw their consent, they wouldn't have to be subject to masters. He says this is true of the most free societies as of the most harsh and militaristic. And there's a lot to that. And what he's talking about is what Gramsci in his prison cells called hegemonic common sense, and the way it's imposed. You just think of it as being like the air you breathe. How could you question it? If you look through history, the process of imposing consent is very striking and interesting one, and it holds today as well. So if you're studying political science.
Yeah.
Suppose that somebody asks the question, suppose somebody brings up to you what Adam Smith wrote about the way the political system works. Try it and see what happens. According to Adam Smith, the people he called the masters of mankind, the merchants and manufacturers of England, are the principal architects of government policy, and they manipulate it to ensure that their own interests are very well attended to, however grievous the effect on the people of England and those subject to the savage injustice of the British abroad. He was speaking of India. Try that in an essay about the United States. It applies almost perfectly, but without knowing what you're studying, I'm reasonably confident that you're not being told that that's how the United States works. This was 1776, the year of the outbreak of the American Revolution. And true to form, when the Constitution was formed in the 1780s, it abided by Adam Smith's precepts. The Constitution was written by a small group of wealthy men, mostly slave owners, and their main concern was to prevent democracy. In fact, the major scholarly study on the Constitution, gold standard in the field, Michael Klarman is called The Framers' Coup Against Democracy. For Madison, the major framer, the goal was to protect the minority of the opulent against the majority. That's the American Constitution.
Wow.
Population didn't like it. There have been struggles ever since, but that remains pretty much the case. We've just been through 40 years of so-called neoliberalism, which is presented as libertarian, but in fact is an effort to ensure that totalitarian institutions, which is what corporations are the principal architects of policy and make sure that their own interests are attended to, however grievous the effect on others. That's the history of the last 40 years, quoting Adam Smith.
Wow.
If this is not what people are taught in their political science courses.
Yeah.
We are taught to consent to ideas like American exceptionalism. The government tries to help people. It's a free democratic society. Everybody has a chance. And quite different from the reality that Adam Smith was able to perceive. And that's the framers of the Constitution were able to perceive when they carried out a coup against democracy. Well, one example in your field, but take anyone you like. Take a neighboring field. You're probably taking courses in international relations.
Yeah.
Study international relations. The main dominant concept is what's called the realist approach. That is, states pursue their national interest. Now, take a look at the phrase national interest. That suggests that it has something to do with interests of the nation. Take a look at actual practice. Has almost nothing to do with the interests of the nation. Has to do with the interests of the masters of mankind who control policy, often very harmful to the nation. So the very first word you learn is already imposing doctrine which is radically at odds with the truth. And it goes on from there. Well, that's the way, going back to David Hume, the way you get to the easiness with which the many are controlled by the few. It's
Wow.
all over, everywhere. And you have to decide, am I going to conform to it and repeat it, get a good job, be well treated, or am I going to raise some questions about it? Like
Yeah.
the kinds of questions I've just been raising. If you do, it might be difficult. If you write an essay on this, chances are you're not going to get an A.
Yeah. I was right before entering, starting our conversation. I was in my international relations class, and we were discussing the IMF, right? And is it still legitimate, a legitimate institution, and is it doing the work it's supposed to be doing, right? So, from a realist perspective, it's concerning that that's the way things are with IMF. But before I turn onto that idea, you touched on democracy and my field, political science. And one of my aspirations is to someday try to go for public office, try to serve. And I am worried that by entering the world of politics, I become part of the problem you've been writing about. What would you recommend me for all? What would you recommend for all of us who are like naive, innocent people who still believe that the political process can be saved? How can we keep the eyes on the ball, our eyes on the ball?
By acting to advance the prospects that the political system can be improved. Saved is a strong word, but can be improved. And you can do things. I mean, there are representatives in Congress who carry out important work with integrity. They can't achieve what I would like, but you have to recognize realities. Take, say, Joe Biden right now. Look at his career. He's not my favorite person. But suppose he wants to, let's say he either wants to or is pressured to carry out some kind of actions that would improve the lives of the population. It's not easy. He's running into a stone wall of total opposition. He's running into a Senate which is controlled by Mitch McConnell, who has made it very clear and explicit that his task when the Republicans are not in power is to make the country ungovernable. He announced that explicitly when Obama was elected. He said, our task is to make sure he cannot accomplish anything. Then, if the country is ungovernable, people suffer, blame it on the Democrats, will come back into office, doing exactly the same thing now. Take a look at the American Care Act stimulus bill.
Yeah.
Uh, most Republican senators in Congress uh, pretty much approve of its provisions. They certainly are aware that their constituents do, but they voted 100% against it. 100%.
Yeah.
Every senator, every representative, very much like the old Communist Party. You take orders from above, and there has to be total obedience. And the task now is to make the country ungovernable. Even though we know this is the kind of thing that people need, we got to stop it because they have to ensure that the worst will happen to the public so we can get back into office. Well, it's going to be that way on every single thing. In fact, the reaction of the Republicans when the stimulus bill was passed is interesting and instructive. Attorneys general in many states, led by Ohio, are already filing suits to block a provision of the stimulus bill which says that the stimulus cannot be used by states to modify their tax legislation, which means to reduce taxes on the rich. So they cannot use the stimulus as a technique for reducing taxes on the wealthy. That's a very fair provision, but the Republicans want to block it, and they're carrying out lawsuits to block it. It'll drag out in courts. It'll hold back money for states and localities, which they badly need. But the task is harm the country as much as possible so that we can get back into office. Okay? Happening before our eyes. It's not a secret. It's on the front page of the newspaper.
Wow.
Okay? So suppose you're in Congress. Suppose you're Alexandria Ocasio-Cortez, you're Bernie Sanders, whoever you might be, or Joe Biden. You have to face that fact. You can't pretend it doesn't exist.
Mm-hmm.
Anything you try to do that might benefit the public is going to be blocked. And it's not easy to find ways around this. You can't simply say, let's get rid of the filibuster. And Mitch McConnell is a good enough parliamentarian to know that there are innumerable ways in which he can keep the Senate even from meeting, literally. Delay the vote, which turns the lights on, anything, a million different ways. So there are all kind of ways to make the country ungovernable. We just saw it with Ron Johnson, wanted to block the stimulus bill. He inserted a demand that has to be met,
Yeah.
that it be read in its entirety on the floor of the Senate. No conceivable point to that other than to make it harder to pass it and to establish the fact that we want the country to be ungovernable. Okay? That's
Wow.
the reality if you go into political office. You can do things, but it's not going to be easy in a society where the masters of mankind have overwhelming power.
Yeah. And as you perfectly put it out right now, thank you for your answer. Is that's what concerns me the most is this tug of war for power within the Congress, and as well as add that to the fact that there are special interests all aboard. That it seems that I want to give everyone in Congress or everyone who's been in the political sphere the benefit of the doubt. They started out just like me and all of those who wanted to enter politics with this side of change, but then reality hits. Reality shows you that there are people bigger than you in the ladder, upper than you in the ladder, who have interests, and then next thing you know, you're taking orders from someone else. So that's my biggest concern. And going into that point is now, according to Pew Research, right now, just about 20% of US adults say they trust the government in Washington. Just 20% trust their own government. How do you think we can begin to regain the trust of all, for at least to increase it more than 20%?
20%, I think, is high. It's usually lower than that in most polls. Same in Europe, and for good reasons. The government does not work for the people. People don't have to know all the details to understand this. They can see it in their lives.
Yeah.
So the answer to it is to get the government to respond to what people's needs and people's wishes. And you can do that. It's true that there are barriers, but they're not impenetrable. They can be overcome. And with the more that you have popular force behind you, the more you can overcome. Well, let's take a concrete example again. Take the most important issue that has ever arisen in human history, literally,
Climate change.
destruction of the environment. If we don't solve that problem soon, nothing else matters.
Yeah.
We've got a decade or two to solve that problem. If we don't manage, everything is gone. Not in a day, but we'll be on an irreversible course towards self-destruction. That's the fact of the matter. Trump's policies were the most malicious in human history. He wanted to maximize the use of fossil fuels, to cut back any regulation which might mitigate their effects, meaning to race to the abyss in the interests of short-term profit for the masters of mankind. It's as simple as that. Well, you can, popular opinion can be mobilized and organized to overcome this, and it's happening. Take Biden's climate program. It's not perfect by any means, a lot of flaws, but it's well beyond anything that preceded. And the Democratic National Committee is trying to hold it back. Republicans are not the only ones. The donor-oriented, Wall Street-oriented, Clintonite neoliberals don't want this kind of thing. So there's a struggle, but there's some success because of popular movements.
Mm-hmm.
Sunrise Movement, a group of young activists, managed to put some kind of Green New Deal on the legislative agenda. It's a big step forward. Biden's program, as I say, not acceptable as it stands, but a big step forward. So popular activism can overcome the Koch brothers network, the Republican Party, the Wall Street bankers, and can overcome it. It's happened before, can happen again. It's happening right before our eyes again.
Yeah.
Those are the kind of struggles that go on constantly. This particular one happens to be the most important one in human history. We either win this battle or we're finished.
Yeah. And it seems that in perspective, now that we've saw what happened with the pandemic, how everything was prioritized to solving the pandemic, it's a as I believe you would argue that it's just a matter of prioritizing climate change. It's even the word climate change, it could be entering into your conversation on manufacturing consent. Climate change seems rather neutral. It doesn't seem that it'll impact me in a way. It's just a change. So, but deterioration of the environment, it's another ballgame. So talking about things as they are can change the whole conversation. But do you think that, for example, you've discussed this in previous conversations. You've discussed that we're seconds from midnight in the Doomsday Clock. And on my perspective as a student, it makes me discouraged unmotivated. If I'm only seconds to midnight, then what's the point of trying to reduce it to minutes, right? But do you think now that the change that is happening around the world and the consciousness of trying to solve the climate change issue, there is no way around it. Do you think we can actually move the clock to say hours from doomsday, hours from midnight?
I think we can take what's called climate change, environmental disaster. There are feasible means, they're known, they're worked out in detail for meeting the conditions of the IPCC, the International Scientific Monitors, to meeting their goals, moving on to a better world. We can do it with about 2 to 3% of world gross domestic product.
Yeah.
That's feasible. The means are there, the knowledge is there. What's in question is the will to implement what we can do. Can that be affected? Yes. That's what organizing, activism, education are about. People in Congress can do it. People outside can do it. Will it be done? Can't predict. Can't predict human choice and will, but we can change it. So yes, it's all feasible. And in fact, every major threat that we face, there are feasible ways to meet it. That's the hopeful part. The questionable part is, can we do it with enough commitment, engagement to achieve what is quite feasible and in fact necessary for any kind of decent survival.
Yeah.
But that's in the hands of people like you.
Yeah, and with your example, I believe that we can rise up to the challenge because standing in the shoulders of giants such as yourself, we can solve this and we can make the world go into the long haul in our species. The future of, for example, thinking of my own children,
I
which
think you can.
I don't even have children or grandchildren, but I want them to at least inherit a world where they can think and ask questions like myself, you know?
It's the proper aspiration.
Yeah.
Unfortunately, I have to go off to another interview, I'm afraid.
Yeah, no, I absolutely understand. And as I said to you, this conversation equals a lifetime experience for me and for our listeners. And just, I'm truly blessed to be living at the same time with you. Thank you for sharing your thoughts with all of us. You have no idea how much impact you make in people's lives, but I really do appreciate you. Thank you so much, Professor Chomsky.
Thank you for what you're doing, and good luck.
Take care.